So I entitled my presentation today, Integrated Watershed Planning, Pitfalls, Prospects, and Perspectives. So I have basically two parts to this presentation. The first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about what integrated watershed management is, at least to me and my background, some principles and best practices for it. And then the second part, well, I'll get into a little bit more of the governance aspects and the public consultation, public engagement, collaborative nature of integrated watershed planning. There really isn't, in my experience, a recipe or step-by-step instructions of how to do integrated watershed management, but I think that there are some learnings that I can share. There's some examples I can share with you today, and I think ultimately in looking at the Muskoka watershed, you have to come up with something that's going to work for you and to work for all of the interested stakeholders that you have in your watershed in terms of involvement. So with that, I would like to get right into what I would consider an integrated watershed management plan. So I tried to actually look for a definition of it, did a Google search on the internet, and it talks about watershed planning, it talks about aspects of watershed management, but a definition of integrated water management or watershed management plan is kind of hard to find. So in my mind, an integrated watershed management plan or integrated management plan is a guiding document for use by stakeholders which sets out collective watershed vision, goals, objectives, targets for addressing the key issues, and include strategies for managing those activities that you implement, monitoring the results, learning and updating the plan. So it's a process, it's a document, but it's dynamic. So the document isn't the end result, it's actually the implementation, the monitoring of the plan and updating the plan, which is part of it as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slides coming up. Within watershed management, or integrated watershed management, or IWM, I think there are a number of embedded concepts. The first one is that natural resources are best managed on a watershed basis. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing a watershed plan. Another concept is that really there's a connection between healthy communities and a healthy environment. And when you look at an environment, are we not part of it? So in order to have healthy ecosystems, we need to have healthy communities and vice versa. Also looking into sort of the governance part of it, managing natural resources is a shared responsibility, and it includes stakeholder participation and shared implementation, because not one agency has the responsibility for carrying out all of the pieces. And so we have to work together towards common goals. Transparent and responsive decision-making built into the whole model. And it would consider a broad range of uses, needs, and values for both humans and the environment. Effective and efficient management, again, back to the governance bit. And we're looking at a process that's adaptive, where you're looking at continuous improvement, best value solutions, or as I like to say, the best bang for the buck, best available science, local knowledge is important to incorporate, and the pooling of resources. So again, these are concepts that are incorporated to a greater or lesser extent in watershed management. And then when we talk about integration, and I'll talk about the difference between integrated and comprehensive, but when we look at what we're trying to integrate, it can be one or more of these bullets, but we're integrating across issues, goals, and outcomes. We're integrating across disciplines and scientific methods. So when we look at the technical background that's done, we usually talk about a multidisciplinary approach or an interdisciplinary approach, where we're bringing people together with different backgrounds to look at solutions. We talk about stakeholders. I'll talk a lot more about stakeholders in this presentation. We talk about integrating across geographic and political boundaries as well. And I know that Muskoka Watershed is large, and you've got a large number of, you've got the district, but you also have a lot of communities within Muskoka as well, and actually a couple of districts. So you're integrating across different political units. You're integrating across spatial and temporal scales, from local all the way up to the watershed, and also funding sources. And you're looking at a variety of funding sources towards implementation. So integration is a concept which is multi-layered, and I think moving on and looking at the difference between integration and comprehensiveness, I think we have to make a distinction here, because I'm not talking about a comprehensive plan, which would be something that looks at as many of the moving parts as possible and tries to pull them all together on a watershed basis. I know that, just as an example, out west, the federal government participated in and funded and resourced a couple of large comprehensive basin plans for those large western watersheds, like the Red River and the Souris River and so on. And what happened is they parachuted folks in and parachuted them out again. So you ended up with this nice tomb of technical information, and very little happened with it. It sat on the shelf. So we're not talking about a comprehensive report like that. We're talking about an integrated approach, where there's various aspects and priorities that are picked and linked together, and you're not looking at the big picture all at once. It's very incremental, very priority driven, and very strategic. And then when we look at the integrated watershed management process, I've portrayed it in a cycle or a cyclical manner, but I think it's really important to point out that you could have parts of this happening at different times and at different levels of maturity, depending on the issues you're dealing with and the data that you have. So when we talk about planning, we talk about looking at the vision, goals, objectives, the outcomes that you would like to have from the work you're doing. We're looking at what indicator and targets you're trying to achieve as part of that plan. But that will take a lot of discussion, a lot of adjustment back and forth. And then you look at the strategies and the actions that you want to undertake and implement. And again, when you're doing things, you learn and you adjust. And then there's the monitoring. And again, so the adjust is in the middle of this model that I'm providing to you today, because I think you learn as you go along, and that's just part of the nature of an incremental an iterative approach. And that's how you move things forward in advance. And I think that sometimes when we're planning, we forget about the monitoring and the evaluation of how well we've done. And so we kind of miss a big opportunity to learn and adjust. So it's all part and parcel of a process that is a continuous dynamic process, with milestones along the way, like the actual plan and the progress report and the technical reports and that sort of thing. So it's not a straightforward process, but lots of individual pieces that need to be knit together. So that brings along some challenges as well. Sometimes the issues can be unclear. They're complex, they're layered, they're interrelated. Sometimes the data is missing, particularly at a watershed scale. So you may have good data in specific areas of the watershed, but not the whole. The monitoring data is not necessarily robust. So you have to work with what you've got and make decisions based on your knowledge and build from there. Roles and responsibilities of agencies and stakeholders are often fragmented and not coherent. There's issues around control and trust amongst stakeholders. And it's hard sometimes to think of the bigger picture when you've got your own concerns and your own priorities to deal with and handle. So I think that, again, the concepts that are associated with IWM, the challenges are there, and we just need to be aware of them to move on and to reduce the what I would call noise and work forward in a very positive and integrated and holistic way, or not a holistic, but not comprehensive, but holistic way. So we're really talking about three buckets of challenges here. You've got lack of technical information, fragmented decision-making and governance, and ad hoc and uncoordinated actions. So how do we deal with that? So what might be required as part of IWM? And I think it's really important that there's a shared vision. There's clear targets and goals amongst the partners, and collaboration is really important. So rather than looking for areas of disagreement, look for areas where you can agree. What are the principles that you can all agree to? So it's much easier to work from a position where you're in agreement than it is when you're not in agreement. Focus on the key issues and look at phased implementation, because if you try to do everything at once, it becomes overwhelming. And I can remember when I was writing my comprehensive exam for my PhD, and I had one question, but it was like a 5-part question. And I had 3 weeks to answer it. And I can remember about halfway through, I thought, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I went into the office on the weekends trying to really collect my brain and to have some quiet time to work on it. And I can remember walking around in circles in the office, and I said, I'm not getting anywhere. And I had to sit down and I had to take it in bite-sized chunks. And you know, once you start tackling those bite-sized chunks, you get to the end. And I've seen that time and time again. So I can't underestimate, don't try to do everything at once. A coordinating mechanism, someone to be the glue to hold all the process together is really important. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this coordinating mechanism, but I think that's really key in moving forward in moving a process forward. The incremental adaptive planning approach, I think, is again linked to those bite-sized pieces and learning by doing. An ongoing participatory process is important as well, I think, to bring all of the stakeholders together and to move forward collaboratively and collectively. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, and that's why I've got that highlighted. The data, we've talked a little bit about that, but you need to know what you're trying to fix and how to fix it before you can fix it or resolve an issue. And so having the report card already generated for the Muskoka Watershed is a key piece. Public education, community stewardship, and looking at where community can come into play and help with implementation and support for however you decide to move forward is key. And I also have here dynamic leaders. Don't underestimate the influence that key influential members, whether they're politicians or people that are well respected in the community, might have. They can really bring others on board. And so tap into that wherever you can. Small successes and celebrations, again, are really key. Sometimes resolving an issue, especially an environmental issue, takes time. And so those small successes are really important to celebrate in order for people to stay motivated and to see progress. And all of the bullets I've just talked about are lessons learned from some more in-depth studies that the US EPA had did. That's the Environmental Protection Agency. But I've seen it time and time again in the different processes that I've been involved in, and they certainly ring true. And then the last bullet point I've got there is partnerships for funding and implementation. It's amazing if you can cobble together resources from different sources, how much you can get done. And so again, another reason for partnerships and collaboration is just to help pool your resources towards a common goal and a common implementation project. So moving on, I think, if done well, and again, I think that the proof is in what's on the ground in various areas of Ontario, you do see measurable progress. You see a dynamic process of continuous improvement, adaptive and progressive decision-making, autonomy amongst agencies, but working together, opportunities to stretch and pool resources. We just talked about that, and mutual benefits, and joint learning and innovation. As I said, there's no recipe for doing this. It's learning by doing, but it's also stretching everyone and advancing some tools and techniques. And I think that's important as well. So that's a little bit on IWM and some of the pitfalls, challenges, and opportunities associated with it. And I did want to move on to governance and engaging and partnering with agencies and folks. Often people get governance confused with government. And so when we look at governance, it's how people influence and collectively make decisions about common interests, both formal and informal, and how those decisions are held to account. So really, we're talking about collective decision making. And then when we look at collaboration, again, I think I made this point before, but No single actor, public or private, has the competency or the capacity to unilaterally address the complex problems that are usually associated with environmental planning. And so collaboration is really key as well. Now I've put this slide up because number one, I got a chuckle out of it, but it really can be very true in that the experiences that public have around public engagement and public consultation is more on the left side of this schematic than it is on the right-hand side. And that makes them very skeptical and very, not very inclined to want to participate in a public process. So moving from collaboration to collaboration is really important in any collaborative endeavor. And so moving from suspicion to trust, from something that's very informal and unstructured to something that's very intentional and rigorous is important. Looking at system outcomes and looking at what you're trying to achieve rather than assigning blame or credit to things is important because you're in it together. Participating to generate value is another key. Data should be what really drives decision making and engagement and action, and not just talking and going around circles forever and ever. So I'm sharing this with you. I've got the source there, and I've also got references at the end of the presentation, which also has this source in it. It's a wonderful little booklet for you to read. So when we talk about governance approaches, you either have top-down governance or bottom-up, or a combination between the two. And just in preparing for this presentation, I found a very simple, but I think informative scale of partnerships that you have to decide on as you're moving forward in integrated watershed management, which works best for you. So we've got what's termed a cooperative model, a collaborative model, and an integrated model, and moving along that continuum of decision making from maintaining autonomy to actually coming up with a new authority, which I know you're not going there, but it sort of looks at the progression. I expect that if you're looking at a collaborative model in Muskoka around things like flooding issues and so on, you're probably in the continuum somewhere between a collaborative model and a cooperative model. But again, it takes you from bringing different groups together and working together, but maintaining your independence and making decisions by consensus, moving through to an organization, for instance, like the Conservation Authority. So it just gives you a context. And then looking at your stakeholders, I think it's always interesting to really sit down and say, well, who are your stakeholders? And by the way, my preference is not for the term stakeholder. It's for a term that's closer to people with perspectives, because we really are talking about folks that may be affected by decisions, people who have an interest in the decisions that are being made, and people that are involved because they're part of the agency or part of the organization which is involved. And they can have different perspectives. They can be they can be negative, they can be positive, they can be active, they can be passive, they can be neutral, or they can be influential. And you need to know sort of what bucket your stakeholders are in, so that you're not dealing with just one type of stakeholder, that you're really engaging the community. And it's good to have voices that are not similar, because that's really when you are able to find some common solutions, I think, to problems. So that's just a reminder that a stakeholder is not necessarily one type of individual or group. And when we look at engagement, I think, you know, it's really interesting to look at this spectrum again of engagement, and it's okay if there are some folks that just want to be informed, and it's okay if you've got folks that want to get their hands dirty and get in there and take action. And there's opportunities for the whole spectrum of stakeholders to be engaged in some way. And so when you're looking at your community engagement, I think it's important to look at all of these methods and look at, you know, what are you trying to achieve, and look at the various opportunities that there are for these different levels of engagement. And in terms of taking action, I realized after I provided the presentation to Rebecca and Christy that in taking action, that also should include things like reporting and monitoring and citizen science and that sort of thing. So the taking action is really in this slide focused on the implementation, but it's important to remember that implementation also includes those other elements of reporting and monitoring as well. Okay, I said I would talk a little bit about a coordinating mechanism, and in the little booklet that I referred to, they talk about a backbone organization for collaborative efforts. And I think you really need to take a look at who is going to be the organization that kind of keeps things together, keeps the process moving to get forward. That is the secretariat, so to speak, calls the meeting, keeps the notes, keeps track of what actions have been undertaken, pulls together, collates information from various sources, and keeps everything in order over the life cycle of the initiative. So, you know, functions of this backbone organization would be to guide the vision and strategy that you come up with, support aligned activities, share results, build public will, advance policy, mobilize funding. All of those things need to be done in the context of the bigger picture. So that's hard for groups to do on their own. So, you know, is it the Muskoka Watershed Council? Is it the District of Muskoka? Is it another organization that is providing that secretariat function? And I wanted to specifically spend a little bit of time on the makeup of a roundtable, because I understand that you're thinking about setting up a roundtable. And I think that when you're looking at a composition and how a roundtable would function, it's really important to have terms of reference, and that the expectations, purpose of the roundtable, and the outcomes are made clear, and that you're looking for a range of perspectives. Equity, inclusion, and diversity are important factors that maybe 20 years ago weren't as important as they are today, but they need to be considered. The time commitment is something that I know if I'm committing to something, I want to know how much time and effort it's going to take. Strength of tie to the constituency or the interest that stakeholder or that roundtable participant is actually representing. I've seen situations where you've got working groups or roundtables or members of a committee that are supposedly representing a sector, but then the expectation of them taking information back to that sector, there isn't a follow-up, and they're not a conduit for that group. So I think it's really important that if you do bring people to a roundtable as a conduit to that particular stakeholder group, that there's some accountability with that representative to make sure that there's good communication between the roundtable and the sector. So I think that's a really important point. Level of influence. I had a mentor who said to me, if you're setting up a roundtable and you're trying to get the job done, it's really important to get people at the highest level there, because those are your barrier busters, so to speak. Those are the people that can make things happen. So again, depending on the role and responsibility that the roundtable has, if you're really trying to make things happen, that's when you look for your champions and get them to the table, because they can influence others. So there's another consideration. The availability of technical staff support, data, that's another thing. What do you need to support the roundtable and the work of the roundtable? What are other opportunities for public input? The roundtable is just one opportunity, but there may be others. So thinking about that. Strong leadership from the chair. I think that's important as well. And the method and communication and structure of the meetings, that should all be up front. So those are things that you need to think about when you're setting up a roundtable, and need to be clear from the get-go, so that there's no surprises or people, once they're into it, decide that it's not for them. So I'm getting close to the end here. I'm conscious of time, but I did pull this checklist from a presentation that I found on the internet again, and that can't be right. August 19th, 22nd, 2021. So I apologize for that. I just realized. But this is from another person who was looking at collaborative co-governance and typical things that cause barriers to a roundtable approach. So I'll leave that with you. My presentation is available through Christy and Rebecca, so hopefully that can be shared. And just some do's and don'ts here. I call it my operational guide, but again, be clear on objectives, know why you're partnering, develop rules of engagement for interactions. And by that, I mean things like being on time for your meetings, that the team is 100% committed and focused on the task at hand, that an open mind is maintained. So you're asking questions like why and what if and why not. Challenge everything and seek wisdom. Equity around the table. So there's no rank around the table. That's why we call it a round table. No finger pointing, no silent objectives, and embrace creative thinking and innovation. So those are just some ideas for what you would put in around a rules of engagement. Developing principles for agreement. I talked about that a little earlier in the presentation. I think that's really important to get off on a really positive note. Be clear about roles, responsibilities, have a roadmap and process milestones that you work on together, that you can measure progress. Be organized, clear on actions and decisions, build on strengths and successes, develop trust. That's key to collaboration. Communicate openly. I had another mentor who said to me at one time, You have to have people either approve or improve on things as opposed to being critical. So you focus on your solutions and move forward. And I think that's really good. If, you know, again, back to my school days, if I got a comment from a teacher that said, I don't like this paragraph, you need to change it, that doesn't tell me what I need to do. So you have to be specific about what you think needs to be improved in order for anything to change. So that needs to be clear. A few other things, and this is my second last slide. Think about the 80-20 rule. So you're not trying to get 100%. You can get an awful lot done if you're able to achieve 80%, because those are usually the key outcomes that you're really looking for. See the big picture, but focus on a little bit at a time. Show you're listening and valuing people's input. Look at what's already been done and build on that. Don't reinvent the wheel. Measure and report on progress and acknowledge and celebrate. So a lot of this is just reiterating and reinforcing what I've said earlier, putting it in a slightly different context. And to finish off then, I have three references here that I think are really helpful and are helpful for practitioners. And I tried to keep this presentation really at the practitioner's level, because I think you're really trying to move something forward that you have to build on experience and not on necessarily theory here. So the partnership toolkit, I've got the link there. The collaboration booklet by Chris Thompson is one. I read it and it really resonated with me. It's about 60 pages, great illustrations in it, and it deals with community economic development, strangely enough, but I could see a whole lot of relevance to watershed planning in that booklet, and you can download it. I would encourage you all to read it. And then some examples of some of the successes that we had in the Grand River watershed when I was working with the Grand River Conservation Authority has been written up in a journal article, and I can actually provide a copy of that journal article as well to you if anyone's interested in reading that. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.